Dear Void, one of the points anti-Semites like to say is, we don't hate Jews, we hate Zionists. It's a slogan they picked up from the Soviets, who started saying it in the beginning of the 20th century, before the foundation of Israel in 1948, to excuse their persecution of Jews. From their perspective, the idea was, well, Zionism is a nationalist movement, while communism is a global one, and anti-nationalist by definition. So when the Russians take over the world and force everyone to live under Russian culture, there would be no need for other nations to exist. Yeah. Communists are never consistent or, decent human beings. Anyway, that was the first time this nonsense excuse was uttered. And of course, low IQ anti-Semites keep regurgitating it today. But this excuse makes zero sense when you realize the simple truth. Most Jews today are Zionists. The two largest communities of the 15.7 million Jews who live in the world are in Israel, where we have 45% of the population, and in the United States, with 40% of the population. Now in Israel, 90% of us are Zionists, and in the States, it's around 70 to 75% according to polls. And nearly all of the smaller communities around the world are Zionists. In total, 80 to 85% of us are Zionists. So saying you don't hate Jews, just Zionists, is kind of like saying I don't hate black people, just those amongst them who, object to slavery. And let's put things in the correct context. When we are talking about Zionism, what we mean is the simplest, most basic form, the belief that Jews have the right for self-determination in our ancestral homeland. That's it. That is the basis of the movement. Now, like any other political ideology, Zionism has also developed flavors. People in the West, especially anti-Semites, like to bring up Ben Gvir. But Ben Gvir, first of all, for years, couldn't even get one single seat in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and even today his party has only 6 seats out of possible 120. So his flavor of Zionism does not represent the majority of Israelis even. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Democrats, a party led by Yair Golan, the leftist party, which has 4 seats today, but is predicted to rise up to 10 seats in the next elections in most polls. And this party is still running on the two-state solution idea and liberal values. Are they Zionists? Of course, just a different flavor. So Zionism is not a one-size-fits-all, which is why you have Zionists in America, for example, who object to Netanyahu. But that does not mean that they don't think Jews have the basic human right of self-determination in their homeland. I mean, I'm not a fan of Netanyahu myself, but while anti-Semites hate him because of the things that he does that are good for Israel, I disagree with him because of the things that he does that I believe that are bad for Israel. In short, while anti-Semites like to think in black and white and treat us all like a hive mind, of course life is more complicated than that. We don't all agree on the flavor of Zionism, but 80 to 85% of us are Zionists. So who are those 15 to 20% of us who are not Zionists? Well, the minority of this group are extremist ultra-religious groups, and they are basically nut jobs. They believe that the Jews have lost their ancient kingdoms and sovereignty due to a divine punishment, and only God can take it back and then bring us back to our land. They envision some kind of a supernatural event, like the sky will open and a huge hand will just scoop us all up or some shit like that. I don't know. Like I said, these people are nut jobs. But the point is, they view Zionism in Israel as a rebellion against God, which of course makes zero sense. No one is supposed to be able to rebel against God. God is the reason of reason. And furthermore, why would God let Zionism flourish and Israel win every fucking war and become one of the strongest economies in the world if he resented the rebellion against him? You see, this is the difference between a good fiction writer and a bad one. A good one maintains consistency within the narrative. Yeah, you can have divine creatures and elves and orcs and wizards, but it all has to make sense within the narrative. If you believe in a divine power that is the reason of reasons and everything is under its control, but then a tiny group of people can just just ignore him and still win all the time, yeah. In short, don't expect consistency from nut jobs. Now, anyway, the more interesting group within the minority of anti-Zionist Jews are the assimilationists. These are the Jews you'll see supporting Islamists, or going to genocidal far-left anti-Semitic hate marches, or signing letters celebrating terrorists and pushing anti-Semitic blood libel against their own people. They might seem like nutjobs too, and in a way they are, but unlike the religious ones who are motivated by an inconsistent fairy tale, these guys are motivated by selfishness and fear. Unbearable, selfish fear. But to really understand them, we need to go down memory lane. See, before the 19th century, most Jews lived in Europe, especially Eastern Europe. The other big population was in the Arab world, and then you had smaller communities in the land of Israel, of course, and in the US, and in places like Africa. Now, at this point, most Jews were basically separatists. The exception were the ones living in the Arab world, who, when the time and place allowed it, became part of the local culture and society without losing their religion or unique national identity. In Europe, they didn't really have a choice but to be separatists, because they were banned from many places and from many professions and were simply not allowed to assimilate without losing their religion, nationality, and identity. That changed with the emancipation during the 18th century, which legally made Jews in Europe equal, although most of the time not in practice. But this gave birth to the movement of Haskalah, the movement of education and enlightenment. It was basically an assimilationist movement. The idea was, now is our chance to prove our worth and make them accept us. And this is where the Jewish obsession with excelling and not being a burden or a source of shame comes from. This idea that if we show them we're good, they will not murder us as much. But by the 19th century, this has started shattering in Europe, as more and more pogroms and anti-Semitic incidents were happening. And Jews started to realize Europe is not about to change. So some moved to the US, hoping for a better life. Others moved to the land of Israel if they could, which was at the time occupied by the Ottoman Empire. And some created the nationalist movement called Zionism, saying the Gentiles will never accept us. Therefore, we have to have our self-determination in our own land and be free of them. Now, when Zionism started, it was very controversial. Most Jews were assimilationists, and they thought the Zionists were ruining it for us. They thought Zionism would enrage the Gentiles and make anti-Semitism even worse. But as more and more of them were exposed to anti-Semitism, to its apparent random and relentless nature, more and more became Zionists. And of course, the Holocaust, which didn't just get 6 million people, most of them assimilationists, murdered, it sent shockwaves. The assimilation experiment has failed miserably. It was time to go home. And when Zionism and the Arab nationalist movement Pan-Arabism collided in the land of Israel, the Jews in the Arab world, by then around 1 million people, were forced to become Zionists as well, as they were persecuted, murdered, and expelled, regardless of their support of the movement. And so we got to a point where most Jews were Zionists, but a tiny minority of assimilationists remained, especially in the US. Some also in Britain, where the Jews discovered that if they hide their Jewishness and declare that Jews have less human rights than all other people, like the right for self-determination, then the locals treated them kinda equally. But the US had a larger group. Why? Because the US, at least on the surface, was good to Jews. They suffered hate and persecution there as well, don't get me wrong. Hell, the FBI said as late as 2022 that anti-Semitism is the most common form of racism in the US. But they were also protected by the law, by the Constitution, and by American ideals. It was the first time that Jews could actually work and make something of themselves, and there were no mobs or corrupted officials to stop them. And they liked it. They were part of the group. Finally. And their brethren, who were still suffering, were far, far away. The sad, shameful truth is that the Jewish community leaders in the US, the people, the rich, the people who have made it, even when they heard about what Hitler was doing in Europe, they still wanted the US to stay out of it. In fact, when Charlie Chaplin, who was not Jewish, but had a conscience, decided to make the film The Great Dictator, ridiculing Hitler, Jewish groups tried to convince him not to do it. And their excuse was, unbelievably, one that I still hear today from Jews, and not only in diaspora, but in Israel as well, when I tell them that anti-Semitism should have consequences. They say it would enrage the Gentiles and make things worse. 6 million were burned by the Nazi beast. But thank God we didn't enrage the Gentiles and made it worse, right? And this self-destructive behavior still exists. And that is who you see supporting Islamists and murderers. These are the people congratulating an elected mayor who is a self-professed anti-Semite and Hamas supporter. These are the idiots and cowards you see in genocidal anti-Semitic hate marches, marching to get themselves back into the gas chambers. Writing books about it, articles, participating in conferences dedicated solely to how can we make a second Holocaust in Israel a reality. Why? Stupidity, selfishness, and cowardice. They are so afraid to lose what they have, and they only see what they have. They only see themselves, no one else. That they think moronically that if they bow down their heads to those who want to chop them off, they would gain their trust and be allowed to keep their life and what they have. So they beg the real people with conscience not to enrage the Gentiles or it will make it worse. They might actually lose a buck or not be accepted to the club of the cool kids. So you see, from this you can learn two things. One, we also have idiots. Not all of us are Nobel Prize winners. We're not floating above the rest of you guys, okay? We have idiots too. And two, when you're saying you hate only Zionists, you're not just saying that you hate most of us anyway. You are saying you only accept Jews if they are willing to admit their inferiority, if they live under your boot. You're not being a liberal when you say that. You're not being not a racist. You're being a Nazi when you say that. And all I can say is, I'm glad most of us are not that stupid and that cowardly. Kiss my ass, Adolf. And that goes double for you little Adolf wannabes out there who just happen to be also circumcised.